Okay, it's 11 sharp. So I would like to thank very much Mr. Scheffer for being with us also in this new year. It is academic year. He was our guest last year as well, and it's an honor, of course, to have you here. And we are very grateful that you find time to share your views and ideas with us and with our students. You have here students of the Master in Diplomacy, students of the Master in International Cooperation. So I forwarded to all of them your biography. So just let me remind a couple of, among the others, in your distinguished career, you were the Secretary General of NATO from 2004 to 2005. Of course, you are diplomatic by career. And in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. Today, you are the chair of the Institute of International Relations, Klingendal. You were, as I always like to mention, because it is my preferred organization, the OSCE. You were the chairman in office of that organization as well, and it is an organization very dear to me. So, Mr. Scheffer, welcome once again. Thank you very much for being here. The title of your presentation is Steering the Known Unknowns into Uncharted Geopolitical Waters. And I think it's just a perfect title for this very complex and frightening, as we said before, situation. The floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Stefania Paradisi, and always a great pleasure to be invited to give this lecture. I hope with a lot of comments and questions afterwards. You mentioned already the title of my lecture, Steering the Known Unknowns into Uncharted Geopolitical Waters. The known unknowns I borrow from Donald Rumsfeld, a former Secretary of Defense of the United States. What is a known unknown? The known unknown was COVID, was the crisis. We knew that there's always a risk of a pandemic. We did not know when it would come. A second known unknown, we all knew also until the day before yesterday of the opinions of Mr. Donald J. Trump. What we did not know, a known unknown, is that, in my opinion, he would stick a knife into the heart of NATO, the heart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I'll come back to this, of course, and that all leads, combined with the fact that we live in a world, we Europeans live in a world, not with one superpower, but with two, the United States of America and China, makes the geopolitical situation, in my opinion, unpredicted as it has seldom been before. Let's start with ourselves. Let's start with us Europeans. And I'll take you back briefly to 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. And in 1991, as you know, the Soviet Union collapsed, ceased to exist in more diplomatic language. What did we do in 1989? We went to the beach. We booked ourselves a beach house, bought ourselves a nice glass of white wine, Italian wine, of course. And we subcontracted our security to the Americans, which we had done all through the Cold War. We subcontracted our energy to our Russian friends, quote unquote. And we had subcontraction in China because China developed into a huge market for our products, our Audis and BMWs, I always tell my German friends. And we could import from China all kinds of products we couldn't make at a decent or a competitive price. And we thought, we have won. The liberal international order has won. And Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous essay, The End of History. And I must admit humbly to all of you that I also thought, when that happened, that we would enter a new era. And perhaps that was the case for a short period of time. But look at ourselves and look at us now, and look at the old continent now. And we are all living there, and we're all members of that old continent, and we're all in the European Union. surrounded by instability as we are. We have a war on the European continent. At 2 hours flight from Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, where I live, an airport you might know. The French say, have a nice expression, nous sommes dans la logique de guerre. We are in the logic of war. We didn't predict this war, and we did not expect this Russian aggression. We misread Vladimir Putin, misread his ambitions, and is now waging a war of aggression. And it's not going too well. And Europe is unstable. We have the horrible pictures on television from the conflict between Israel and Hamas. The Middle East and Northern Africa is in turmoil. Africa, our neighboring continent, the Middle East, without too much exaggeration, our backyard. Ships are being attacked in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and in the Red Sea. Instability, a conflict, by the way, dear friends, with the risk of escalation. There is still a huge risk of escalation, and as we speak, even the Americans, even Anthony Blinken, even President Joe Biden visiting the region is not able and is not capable to reach what should, in my opinion, be absolutely necessary, and that is a ceasefire rather today than tomorrow. Instability with as its background, in my opinion, and we could discuss it, the more fundamental battle for power and influence in the Middle East and North Africa between Iran and its so-called axis of resistance, its proxies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and the rapprochement which we saw before this horrible slaughter by Hamas started in Israel in the beginning of October. The battle for power and the fact that the mullahs in Tehran apparently were of the opinion that the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel went a bit too well for them. So there's a big power battle in the background of that Middle Eastern conflict. Israelis are suffering, Palestinians are massively suffering in Gaza. Instability. A third area of instability, which should get much more attention, in my opinion, certainly also for Italy as a member state of the EU and NATO in the southern part of Europe, which is Africa, and more specifically the Sahelian zone. There you see a toxic combination leading to grave instability. Some people told me there is an Afghanistan 2.0 in the making in the Sahelian zone. You have the toxic combination with all kinds and forms of terrorism. Demography, where women are still getting many children because the more children, as you know, the better the life insurance. There are ungovernable parts of the Sahelian zone. There are military coups. The French are kicked out of Sahel. What I now experience is that it is spreading into the northern parts of in principle, stable country of Ghana, Togo, Benin. In other words, Africa, our neighboring continent, the result will be migration. People migrate from the world of disorder to the world of order. That part of Africa is the world of disorder. We in Europe are the world of order. I don't need to explain this to Italians, I think, given the struggle you have in Italy, only mentioning Lampedusa, and the struggle the European Union more in general has with migration. A European Union surrounded by instability, and for that instability, we have, with a slight exaggeration, not yet found the beginning of a convincing political answer, which is one of the big challenges of Europe and of the European Union. And as I said in my introduction, the European Union, which has to get used and grow used to the fact that we live in a two-superpower world, and that the main theater geopolitically in that complicated geopolitical situation is how will the relations between those two superpowers develop. the United States of America and China. If you want to read a very interesting book, I think I said this last year as well, about the situation and scenarios where you have one vested superpower and you have another challenging superpower, as we see with the US and China. Read the book, which is called Destined for War, by Harvard professor Graham Allison, Allison. What he does in the book is he analyzes, I think, 12 scenarios beginning in the old days between Sparta and Athens, and analyzes those scenarios, and most of these scenarios at a certain stage end in a certain form of conflict. Now, I'm not predicting war or very serious developments between the US and China, although you can't exclude it. But read the book and realize that that is the main theater. And what is the challenge for us Europeans and for the European Union to find its place in that geopolitical theater, where we can never afford equidistance between us and the United States of America. Anyway, as long as the US, I should now say, after Trump, provide us with our ultimate security guarantee, we can never afford equidistance, but we have to develop a relationship with China as well. And I think the European approach vis-à-vis China, even under a Biden administration, is not the same one-on-one with the United States of America's approach, which goes direction decoupling of the economies of the US and China. That's not exactly where we are. A two superpower world, a complicating factor and a difficult factor for the European Union. Another element for the European Union to pay attention to, which we haven't done sufficiently, in my opinion, is we have to pay attention politically, in the first place, to what is called the Global South. Think about nations, important players like India, like Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey. I mean, nations which want to have a voice, and they are right to claim a voice on the geopolitical theaters. India as the main regional rival to China. India as the nation which has already overtaken China when you look at the number of inhabitants. India as a hugely growing economy, as a technology hub, as a nation which might provide the bridge between the West and the South. We have, I think, too much not only taken them for granted, but neglected them politically. Look at the BRICS. I mean, they have their internal differences. Look at nations who have been invited for the BRICS. My plea would be that the European Union pays more political attention, realizing that the liberal international order we are claiming to defend against autocracy, against the lack of democracy, is not exactly their international order. And that we in the West, we Europeans, Americans, the West in the cultural political sense, we do not call the shots anymore in the world. Which we have done for ages. And that means that we have to make a mental and political switch to adapt ourselves to that new geopolitical situation which we have seen. One further remark about the main theater between the United States and China. Very difficult as it is. As I said, quoting Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, we do business with China on the basis of the principle small yard, high fence. We build a high fence for ourselves around China. We create a small yard, and within that small yard, we can do business with China. But for the rest, to take the one important element of tech, I think I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that the Biden administration and the Americans are waging a tech war with the Chinese to prevent the Chinese from keeping up with the US, keeping up with the West as far as the more sophisticated elements of technology are concerned. Be it quantum computing, be it biotechnology, be it artificial intelligence, be it the high-end semiconductors, the high-end chips. The Americans do everything they can to keep China at a distance, and that is not exactly the position I think the European Union is in and should be in. So expect an interesting debate between us Europeans and the United States on China policy. That is already the case under a Biden administration. Imagine what it would be. I don't need to explain myself further how that situation would be if President Donald J. Trump would be on the steps of the Capitol in January 2025. I'll come back to Trump in a moment. So this is the whole relationship with China and the US is one of the important challenges of the European Union. Looking at the main players, the United States of America, no need to explain to you as specialists, polarized as never before, apart perhaps from the China policy I mentioned a moment ago. On the threshold of the presidential campaign and the presidential elections. And a few remarks I should make, blending with the opinions of one of the potential candidates, Donald J. Trump. Let's realize that if you look at the demography in the United States of America, we are perhaps as Europeans a bit spoiled in the political sense by the fact that we now have a traditional Atlanticist US administration. President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken are the typical examples of the Atlanticist Americans, East Coast mainly, but West Coast as well, with whom I grew up with in all the decades of my international career. They might be, as the saying goes, the last of the Mohicans, in the sense that if you look at the demography in the United States of America, if you look at the opinion of the younger, your generation in the United States of America, the Biden-Blinken combination might well be one of the last combinations in the traditional Atlanticist America, where you not only have that younger generation, but where you also have a Republican Party, which is now, I would say, almost totally in the hands of Donald J. Trump. And we know, I don't need to explain myself, what the MAGA ambitions of the Republican Party and of Donald J. Trump is. And in that Make America Great tradition, as Donald J. Trump has proven a few days ago, there is no direct solidarity with anyone. There is no direct solidarity with NATO, no direct solidarity with Europe, and there they have a essential element. They say to us Europeans, look, guys, we have to focus on the Indo-Pacific. We have to focus on the second superpower. Think what I said about Graham Allison's book. You are much more on your own than you might think. Now, what has happened today before yesterday, we are indeed much more on our own than we think and we realize, because as I said, it's a dagger into the heart of the North Atlantic Alliance. A known unknown. I didn't realize when I passed on this title to the institute that we would be in this situation, and that there would be serious doubts about the nuclear guarantee given to us since 1949 by the United States of America. We are disappointed. If you look at the comments, we are angry. But the battle between those who are the most angry is not the battle we should fight, in my opinion. First of all, we have, of course, to see what the result of the presidential election will be. It might well be that we'll see a second Biden administration. But we cannot be blind, and we cannot think that we have all the time to think about this absolutely fundamental element of European security, where, as I said, we have misread Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, totally misread. We have not listened, by the way, to our Baltic friends, to our Polish friends, who always told me and told us, be careful and beware, because there is a real threat emanating from Moscow and from Vladimir Putin. We said, no, no, no. In The Hague, but also in Rome and Madrid and Brussels, we said, okay, it will be all right. It will be all right. Putin will realize that he should not have any ambition. Well, he has these ambitions. And if Ukraine might lose this conflict or might lose this war, Putin's hunger will not be stilled. Nous sommes dans la logique de guerre, and I think will not exaggerate when I say this. So what to do? Not only being angry. Yes, we are angry. We're disappointed. We are frustrated. We have underspent on defense for decades. I do realize we have ourselves to blame. Trump is not entirely wrong. But what might be the consequences? And I'll make it a bit difficult for the discussion for us. And then we should focus on the nuclear domain. We have never discussed seriously because it wasn't necessary, and we considered it far too dangerous a debate. What is the replacement for the American nuclear guarantee in an era where Trump has threatened us with nuclear weapons in the framework of Ukraine? Should the European Union have a nuclear weapon? Should Europe have a nuclear weapon? What's the role of the British if we discuss nuclear weapons? If we discuss defense? The European Union without the UK militarily is basically only France. What is the role of the French force de frappe, the French nuclear dimension? The Brits, they have nuclear weapons, but they are very closely aligned to the American nuclear capabilities. What would happen if Trump would really do what he pretends to do? I think, and I go back into history, and some of you might recognize my formula. I think the day before yesterday gave at least me the reason to make a strong plea for a fundamental reappraisal. I repeat, a fundamental reappraisal for European defense. Should that be a European pillar inside NATO? Will the NATO alliance survive Trump unscathed? Difficult to answer those fundamental questions. But what we should do at least is take our own defense extremely seriously, including a very complicated discussion on nuclear weapons. And then I come to a fundamental point in this debate, and I'm speaking more specifically to your generation, and that's the following: we Europeans, is my experience, we have a DNA which is peace and stability. Not for nothing, I quoted Fukuyama and myself with The End of History. The European Union is a peace project. Never war again on the European continent. NATO is to prevent war, is also a peace project as such. Our DNA is peace. Putin's DNA is not peace. And I'm afraid that we have to work on our DNA, how complicated and difficult that is. And more specifically in your generation of my children who now are in their early 40s. I have grandchildren who are growing up, and they have grown up in peace and stability. Yes, they know about a bit of, my daughters know about the horrible war in the Balkans in the 90s. But for the rest, it was in general peace and stability. And now it is a different ballgame. Nous sommes dans la logique de guerre, and we have to prepare for a potential conflict. And that is very, very difficult, not only because of the DNA, but because of the fact that our leading politicians do have the same DNA. And it's very difficult for them to go to their constituents and say, well, listen, guys, we know that we have problems in education, in the budget and social security, and we have migration and we have everything. But may I ask your attention, please, for defense and for the military and for building up the military and for creating a defense industry in Europe worthy of that name. That is psychologically and politically a very complicated and huge challenge. But in my opinion, it should be met. And I add, Putin has the time. The Taliban, as you might know, in Afghanistan always told me, you might have a watch, but we have the time in Afghanistan. And the Taliban was right. And there's now a horrible Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Putin says the same. You have a watch, I have the time. Putin can wait for the US presidential elections. Putin can wait for elections in all our nations. Putin can wait for populism in Europe gaining ground. He has the time. Autocracies have much more time than democracies. Because they have, and you have, and we have elections every 4 or 5 years. So we are always a bit short of breath in the political sense. But this is, in my opinion, the key, that we work on our European DNA, and that our political leaders have the courage to give an honest assessment of the situation to their constituents. Let me take my own country. Where the biggest party after the elections we had in November is now Mr. Wilders. You will know his picture with the blonde hair. He has about 1/3, and in the opinion polls he has about 1/4, and in the polls about 1/3 of the total seats in parliament. And he is against assisting Ukraine. He is against speaking about defense. And if I look at Germany and other countries, you have the same kind of development. And in Italy, you have the same discussion. This is the huge challenge for the European Union, and it is a very complicated one, given that the fact that it asks for a completely different mindset. Speaking about the European Union, I define the EU always as a financial economic giant. A political adolescent at best, and a military midget. And that might be funny, that comparison, but the military midget should now really grow up, because otherwise it will not be able to further develop. And I hope our political leaders will realize. And for that growing up, the European Union needs a few other things, I think, which are of the essence. And I'll go through my list briefly. And I do this under the heading: the world doesn't wait for Europe till it's have its act together. The world doesn't wait for us. The world doesn't wait for Europe. And I have, in my long career in international affairs, never heard the bell ringing so loudly for Europe, and for a European identity, and for a European development in many domains. In the internal market, it seems a second-rate argument after what we heard from Donald J. Trump, but we have a serious problem with the internal market, with fair competition. If I tell you that France and Germany combined between August 22 and March 23, so it's a year ago, that Germany and France together spent 733 billion euros. I repeat, 733 billion euros in state support for their own industries. It's their own money. It's not European money. It's their own money. And the European Commission agreed, because they had all kinds of waivers because of the COVID pandemic and what have you. Your countryman, Mario Draghi, will present a report in the spring of this year on the future of the internal market. If the internal market goes on or doesn't go on as it is now, we will lose it. And that is, if I speak about the financial economic giant, the internal market, and the level playing field is one of the most important pieces of the development of the European Union, as is competition policy. And you know that a number of years ago there was a project where Siemens and Alstom wanted to merge to produce high-speed trains. And that merger between Siemens and Alstom was forbidden by the European Commission because it didn't comply with competition rules in the European Union. And the Commissioner was right, it didn't comply with European Union rules. I think that we should have a very serious look at our competition policy when I see developments in China. and I would be in favor of creating European giants, big European companies, so that they can enter into the battle with the Chinese. Do you see what's happening on the European market with me now? I don't know if it's the same thing in Italy, but the Dutch market is at the moment overflown, really, with Chinese electric vehicles. Absolutely, by the thousands they come in, and Volkswagen and other more classic French also electric vehicle producers have the greatest problems to survive, I can tell you, and I dare to predict. So there is a very serious discussion we should have on the internal market, on competition policy, and linked to that on industrial policy. And we should also not forget that even under a Biden administration, we have lots of discussions on these issues, competition, industrial policy, with the US administration, even with the Biden administration. You've heard about the Inflation Reduction Act and the way the Americans try to lure European companies not to invest in Europe, but to come to the United States with all kinds of niceties and sweets involved. Third point, we need in the European Union a much more consistent China policy. I already mentioned that the Americans, in my view, are more radical vis-à-vis China than we should want to be in the European Union. And I mentioned this already when giving you the example of the electric vehicles. So these are very important points, and I should add a few last points. Let us not, as Europeans, leave the competition on artificial intelligence, on tech, completely to the Americans and the Chinese. We are now starting to realize in the European Union, when we see fabs, as it's called, of tech giants like TSMC and Intel on European soil in Germany and elsewhere, Putin once said a true word: who will control AI will control the world. So in the tech domain, we are lagging behind as Europeans, and we should not leave that battle to Americans and Chinese. I have in my notes here in front of me, more relevant than ever, don't wait until the American elections to start thinking about the United States of America under a Trump administration. Now, we have been thrown into a very cold ice bath the day before yesterday. So I do not think that this opinion of mine needs any further explanation. There is a NATO defense ministers meeting this week as we speak. There is the Munich Security Conference in the coming weekend. Follow the stream of Munich if you have the time coming weekend, because it will be a very interesting meeting and conference. So briefly, after Trump's remarks and what I said about them, what should be the consequences of the remarks of Mr. Trump. Last but not least, a strong European Union is in need of strong democracies. And do realize what I said about populist parties and about the success they have as we speak in Europe. A strong European Union, an influential European Union, needs strong democracies. And if I make my political analysis of what has happened the past years in Europe and in the European Union more in particular, the political middle ground has lost a lot of ground and has lost a lot of appetite. And my opinion is that solutions for the problems I have mentioned in my lecture, solutions usually come from the political middle and not from the flanks, be they on the left or be they on the right. And I think in this regard, there is a lot of work to do in Europe. A European Union, strong European Union, needs strong democracies. And also think with me, I'll not work it totally out given the time. Do realize with me that we are also in the process of deciding or having to decide and having to judge, where does Europe end? Where does the European Union end? There is a promise to Ukraine to become a European Union member, also for Georgia, also for Moldova. There are 6 or 7 nations in the Western Balkans already knocking for a long time on the European Union's door, wanting to come in. And I do think personally that when you make these kind of political promises, at a certain stage you have to deliver. And one of the huge challenges, and with that challenge I will end, of the European Union will be, what are the consequences of this huge enlargement? And I'm not talking about 5 or 10 years. I think it's not wise to say Ukraine will be an EU member in 2030. That will not happen, believe me. But we have to prepare for enlargement. Our decision-making structure is unfit for these kind of enlargements. Our common agricultural policy, we see the farmers everywhere in Europe going down the streets today in Antwerp, in Belgium, in many other nations last week. What is the future of the common agricultural policy? When Ukraine has an agriculture aerial which geographically is as big as your country, as big as Italy. You now already see the tensions between Ukraine and Poland, where it concerns the imports of grain and wheat and barley and what have you. So in other words, I do say the European Union will need to expand, will need to enlarge, but the how is extremely difficult. And the same parties all across Europe who are blocking assistance and aid to Ukraine are also very much not in favor, anti a European Union enlargement. So I think this discussion, we can't avoid it. We can't avoid it. Guys, I have focused a lot on Europe and the European Union in uncharted geopolitical waters. It was my pleasure, and I hope that on the basis of my introduction, you might have some comments or questions. I hope you have them, by the way. And I'll stop here. Stefania, over to you. Back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting and thorough analysis of the challenges ahead of us.